Esteemed colleagues and guests, it is my pleasure to welcome you to City Scripts this evening. City Scripts is a monthly curation of book talks, panel discussions, lectures, and other creative expressions on the city. And today we have with us two versatile creative practitioners who are also brilliant scholars in their areas of work. To the IIHS audience, Amlan Goswami needs no introduction. It is an honor for us to host the release of his third book of poetry titled A Different Story, published by Poetry Wala. Amlan's first book, The River Wedding, was shortlisted for the Sahitya Academy Award. He has published poetry in journals and anthologies across the world, including Poetry, The Poetry Review, Penguin Vintage, Rattle, and Sahitya Academy. And he is also a Best of the Net and Pushcart nominee. Amlan's poems have been translated to installations and exhibitions in both India and abroad, and his poetry readings cover several major cities across the world. Mustansir Dalvi is an author of many books, including three books on poetry. We are honored to have Mustansir here to release and talk about his latest work, a biography on Charles Correa, titled Citizen Charles, a biography of Charles Correa. Now, apart from being a poet, Mustansir is an archivist, professor of architecture, editor, and translator, and a pan national presence in architecture, culture, and urbanism. The session today will run for 40 minutes each, followed by a question and answer. Over to the speakers. Please come on stage and discuss your two books, two voices, and two ways of seeing a city. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pooja. Yeah, thanks. Um, it's nice to see in a ways, my extended family here. And so the first two books also got launched at various IIHS things, and this is a very intimate kind of audience. This conversation is about 3 years in the making, and I think we had a chat in 2022, and he was busy, but the opportunity also has to present itself, and the stars also have to align. So the opportunity is that Mustansir came up with a new book, I have a new book, and then the dates matched, and today was the only day that kind of matched. So thank you, Mustansir. And so how we'll go about this is that we'll get to his book first. So I'll be asking questions, and at some point in the conversations, the tables will turn, and Mustansir will ask me about my book. So it's like Mustansir is batting first, I'm bowling first, and then depending on the pitch, and he can take his revenge. So on that note, the first thing is this book, uh, Charles Correa, Citizen Charles, published by Nyogi under a very interesting series called Pioneers of Modern India, which feature uh, known lights, but at the same time not extraordinarily famous outside their disciplines. And so it's the kind of work that was a long time coming, but it's great that Nyogi decided to go about doing it. And it's also meant for not a professional reader of that discipline, but uh, the general reader. Am I correct? So my first question is: a person like Charles Correa is enormously multifaceted. Apart from his architecture, his urbanism, he was also a filmmaker. He made films. His writing is exceptionally lyrical. It's just a treat reading him, not just because of his ideas, but also the manner in which it's written, so lucid. So first is, how do you kind of, whenever you're writing about a giant like him, it's always, it's in some ways it's paralyzing because one can't even start. And you had a brief of writing for a general audience. So how did you go about doing this? And initial impressions of how you put it together. There are academics here, so the archival stuff, the anecdotal stuff. So how did it start, and how did you bring it together?
But just an idea has just occurred to me at this very moment that for a person of that stature and greatness and all that, perhaps the best thing to do is to write a small book. In that sense, one can get absolutely the essence of the person. No doubt, this book is only one, and there will be many, many more. Especially, there will be more detailed, more researched, more in-depth biographies of a person like Charles Correa, and I welcome them and look forward to them. This was an exercise that was, uh, I mean, it's a commissioned thing by Neogi Books for this series. And I think the way I went about it was primarily that, how do you present Charles Correa as a pioneer of modern India, which he very, very much is. I think his location in the nation state is very significant, and his legacy is very significant as well. So, taking that as the starting point, uh, I started to research as well as to write this book. It took me about 2 years to do. Uh, and What I did essentially was to locate Charles in his context, which was the context of a newly formed country with a very erudite and intelligent and generous head of state who really, in one sense, becomes the mentor to a large number of pioneers, you know, uh, in order to shape the nation. And Charles Correa, being an architect, is one such shaper. Incidentally, this series also has books on people like R.K. Narayan, R.K. Lakshman, Homi Bhabha, Subba Lakshmi, Sham Benegal, and others. Even there are also a few who are relatively unknown, but they need to be known better, through this series. So each one of these has had an impact on the post-independence life of our country, and each one of them is brought out through this fairly slim volume, so that a general reader, not somebody who is in depth or very well versed in a particular subject, in this case architecture, can access. So that was the means by which I went about doing this.
While you say that, I mean, the book itself has lots of aspects which also an architect or a specialist can also engage in. So that said, so it has a bit of both, and I think the manner in which it has been written, while addressed to a general audience, also has facets which may not be so clearly obvious even to practitioners of architecture or biographers, as the case may be, and we'll come to that in a bit. Um, One thing I learned, my reading of Charles Correa before this book was more technical in the sense I'm not an architect, but it was more along the urbanization agenda, the Charles Correa Commission, National Commission on Urbanization, essays of which he's well known for, and so on. What I saw from this book is how uh, you gathered snippets of his life in a way that uh, shows deep research. In a way, I mean, you show a playful side of Charles very early. There was a side to him which was not this, like all, bringing out that side is was very interesting. For example, you talk about, for example, when Charles was a kid, he got a present of a Hornby train set, and that train set used to dabble in that, and then you link that up to other things that that train set almost became an archetype for limited means but unlimited possibilities around that set. uh, in 1954, for example, his MIT thesis was actually an animation film, and this is as early as 1954. So these are snippets which, I mean, even people who knew Charles may not have been entirely familiar with, and so I just A is uh, how do you and where did you find them, but also aspects of Charles which are uh, otherwise not so well known, and where he's dabbling with stuff, he's playing with stuff. Like with all, anybody who's a great practitioner of one's craft, without play there is no flow. Without flow there is no, there's no work. So, would you like to tell us a little more about those aspects, especially how this train set manifests itself at different points of his architectural practice?
Yeah. Well, that is probably one of the loveliest origin stories, if you like, of an architect. And he has written about this himself, where he says that when he was very, very young, he was presented with a set of uh, toy trains. It's a sort of thing we just don't see now. But, essentially what that is that you get these two or three, you get an engine and you get these two or three compartments, and they all fit on a set of metal tracks. Okay, and then those tracks, they come in a variety of shapes. So you may either have straight tracks or curved tracks or half, one fourth of a circle tracks and all that. And you fit them, to form various configurations. And what Charles talks about is not so much enjoying the fact that he has a toy train and he can, say, play a conductor, or he can play a passenger, or whatever it is. But he was more obsessed with the tracks rather than the trains. And he, even as a child, would be would keep on making different configurations based on those limited units. Think of it as a very early Lego set. Okay, only in this case, the tracks would come in 3 or 4 formations. But when you put them together, you could create a whole bunch of things. You could create straight tracks or curved tracks, tracks looping on themselves, figures of eight, and so on and so forth. And he used to draw them out on graph paper, to create newer and newer uh, uh, ways in which those tracks could be done, and then, of course, put them together and run the train on them. Uh, so, this idea that you can take a few limited number of alternatives, but mix and match them to create a very large number of unlimited end products, sort of is seen throughout his career as an architect, where he has a few uh, ideas that he keeps on repeating, right? He had a practice of about 60 years. But the kind of ideas you see right in the beginning of his career, say when he does something like the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya, and the end of his career when he does the Champalimont Center in Lisbon, there is still a certain consonance. There is a confluence of ideas, pretty much like a train set, the tracks of a train set. He talks about the open center. He talks about climate as a governing principle. He talks about the ritual pathway through a building. All these ideas you see in building after building. Okay, and these then make up his practice. But to a very large extent, when you go to these buildings, you don't just see it as a repetition of things. Each one is, like a kaleidoscope. It has a few sets of colored pieces, but every time you turn it, you get something entirely different. And we tend to see that in his buildings, and I think that is what makes them special.
Mhm. Well, Charles, the architect. Let's go there. Where would you place Charles Correa in the Indian modernity nation building experiment inaugurated by Nehru, on the one hand, and where would you place him in the context of modernism in architecture itself? So there are two things, they're coming together in the 50s. You mentioned the four big names. You say there's Habib Rahman, there's Achyut Kanbinde, there's
Doshi.
Doshi, and then there's Charles.
Yes.
And And you also talk about the long shadow of Le Corbusier. And there are lots of interesting anecdotes which we have come across, for example, books on Chandigarh, etc., talk about how Corbusier was identified, etc., etc. Not going there, but historically, uh, in the nation-building experiment, uh, in architecture itself, and where would you place Charles? Also, in the context of these other three or four huge names, Stein came a little later. You don't talk about him.
There are several others as well.
There are several others, and also that uh, with Corbusier, the idea of concrete became the rage. And so it allowed a lot of possibilities around which you could do a building, the RCC thing.
Yeah.
And you talk about Charles as someone who contextualizes concrete and is hence different from others. So, and there's also Bauhaus going on at the same time. So, just a little context for everybody. And now in history, 70 years on, where would his place in history be?
So I put him in the company of these three others. Uh, Habib Rahman and Achyut Kanvinde are slightly older to him, and Doshi is more or less a contemporary. But all these, uh, after independence, essentially, one tends to see that there is the need to build a lot of institutions of the state. Uh, Before this, in the colonial period, a whole set of institutions had been built. But as we see in say places like Bombay and so on, but in a place like Delhi, which is now the capital of the uh, newly independent country, many institutions need to be built. At the same time, in places like Ahmedabad, for example, that becomes the first kind of rising city after independence, where there is a lot of wealth, and by extension, buildings have to be built. So you find these four architects immediately kind of expressing themselves through a kind of architectural practice. What is interesting to see is that post independence, the idea that we should have a so called Indian architecture, one doesn't see too much of. Okay, Bangalore is probably the only exception with that one
Vidhan Saudhan.
spectacular building, which could, in one sense, be a way of expressing Indian architecture. But if you look at the buildings which come up right from the late 40s right until the 60s, you see the kind of architecture is, in a sense, no different from the state of the art in the rest of the world. And I would suggest that this is an active promotion of the head of the state, who does not wish necessarily to, take the baggage of the past. And there are two baggages, please remember, not only the Indian baggage, but the colonial baggage, and try and bring it back. One of the things that we should talk about is the fact that in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, under the British, you had buildings which were called revivalist. Okay. Revivalist buildings means that you have buildings for contemporary use and which were never seen in the past, but all dressed up in the garb of buildings either 500 years old or 1,000 years old or 1,500 years old. So that sort of thing, that sort of revivalism, was really not the model one wanted for a nation state.
Railway station domes.
Yeah, the railway station, the neo-Gothic buildings or the neoclassical buildings or even buildings, and I think the clincher is the British trying to build like Indians in buildings which imitate the Mughals and so on. Now, post-independence, all that is really not necessary. But what can definitely be done is to have buildings that look, or that stand shoulder to shoulder with buildings in the rest of the world, whether it's in Europe or the United States or southern American continent, or other parts of the world. And the new materials and the new construction technologies which are coming out do not necessarily promote a kind of old age revivalist kind of building, simply because the structural framework starts to change. You no longer have buildings that are relying on the transfer of loads onto the walls, which is what leads to a lot of the older buildings. You now have buildings which are entirely built on frames, which is RCC and steel and so on, which gives you a completely different vocabulary and a completely different way of dealing with whatever it is you're doing, whether it's function or climate or culture and so on. And these buildings which come up in the early days, they are amazing explorations of this kind of new technologies. I mean, now looking back at the past, we call them modernist, and so on. But for them, it was what was happening all around them at that time. RCC plays a very big role because I think in the case of Korea at least, there is a certain democratization. There is a certain almost, it becomes a material for everybody to use.
Mhm.
When RCC first came into being in the very early 20th century, late 19th century, it was still an exclusive kind of material by which certain buildings were built in Europe and so on. But by the time you have almost mid-century India, and RCC comes in a big way, uh, via, I must mention, the entire 25 years of Art Deco architecture in the entire country. The expressions of RCC in order to create the new buildings of the nation state are done by all these architects. Now, some of them, in their early buildings at least, uh, try to be like the rest of the world, what we now, I think, later start to call as brutalist. That very hard shapes, very rough kind of uh, ways by which the RCC is presented, unadorned, very heavy forms, and so on. I think Korea finds a different way. And I believe that, this is my belief, that one of the reasons why he's different is because a lot of his initial projects in the country are to deal with Gandhi. Like he does the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya, which is almost his first project. Okay, he later does another two buildings related to Gandhi. One is a memorial for Kasturba in Pune, and one is a little bit of an extension of the Rajghat, and so on. And if you look at, say, the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya, even that is a building which has some amount of RCC in it and so on, but is presented in such a scale and such a manner that is completely humane, completely, brings the scale down to the level of the persons who are in it, and creates this kind of impression of the kind of frugality, but uh, at the same time, dignity that Gandhi had always talked about when it came to the people in India, and especially the people in the villages. So, couple of things emerge. One is that his scale then is defined by this kind of uh, initial impetus of building things down to a certain extent.
Which time period would the Sangrahalaya be? Around
Uh, yeah, the late 50s, early
late 50s.
60s. And the other thing, which I think is also very important, that he realizes that RCC in its use is also possible through not high tech but low tech. Okay, so both in its mixing, in its transport, in its placing in the buildings and all that, that can be done largely through labor intensive means, and thereby you can bring in a lot more people into the building site, and you can create greater opportunities and so on. And that itself, I think, becomes a way by which his choice of architecture starts to differ from the other three, some of whom, like say in the case of Doshi and Kanvinde and all, are still building, more brutalist buildings than Korea. At the same time, there is this entire period of an entire presence of Le Corbusier, in the 50s and early 60s, with the Chandigarh project, the capital buildings in Chandigarh, and the Ahmedabad buildings, which four or five of them, which are done by Le Corbusier. And his impact is so great that probably, like I said, I have a chapter called The Long Shadow of Le Corbusier. And Korea is very impressed by that as well, because I think Korea also, probably to a certain extent, sees how Le Corbusier can take a material like RCC and make it, more accessible to the, people at different levels, people at different scales. Uh, but he doesn't want to imitate Korea in Le Corbusier in the sense of those huge forms and so on. So there are a couple of buildings which he does like that, the Lever House Pavilion and the Lever Pavilion and so on, but you don't see more of it later.
I was reminded of uh, Korea's article on Chandigarh, which was a critique of Corbusier, written in 1964, and that's why I asked the question. So, if he was already inspired and influenced by the Sangrahalaya's work, because in that critique of Chandigarh, I think it's called Report from Chandigarh, and this flying man in the flying trapeze, all that.
Yeah.
But one thing which, and of course, written in a very, it's so beautifully written, he calls Chandigarh a city in the making without an umbilical cord. It's the second sentence. Yeah. And what he actually criticizes Corb is basically the visual spectacle that Le Corbusier is increasingly getting into as an end in itself. That the spectacle is taking over, and all else is kind of subservient to that spectacle. And there are also implicit noises about personality and all that, which he does a very nice job of, and he kind of hides it within nice, interesting language. But you can see a general disquiet with the master, so to speak, and the master is all over the world now. And I think to some extent, the idea that, I mean, these ideas, then his idea of the courtyard, the threshold, the buffer places, you talk about these places in the Sangrahalaya, whether the museum fatigue.
That's
That if you keep seeing this, even if the stuff is very good, if you keep seeing it like in after one room after another, it's just basically it's too much. So you need spaces where there's threshold spaces, liminal, so to speak. And there, I'm just wondering, because there he completely departs from what were otherwise like the predominant norm of how buildings were done.
Yeah.
Buffer zones.
No, that's true entirely. Like I said, that's where he gets his kit of parts. That's where the Hornby trains again start to show up. That these are things you can use again and again in different manifestations. The idea of museum fatigue actually he gets from his teachers in MIT, who have who present this idea that when you go to a museum, that is a very, very distinct possibility that if you just keep walking through the museum at a certain point, it will all get too much. I think the Louvre is one of those examples where you can just have infinite corridors and all that. And you need to have this release. And in the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya, that is where you have these beautiful little courtyards. The light comes into the building. There is a water body. There are these louvers which allow you to see out of the building and so on. It allows you to stop, contemplate a little, and then continue. And I think those then become part of the vocabulary of other buildings as well.
Mhm.
Okay. But at the same time, I think one shouldn't exactly discount the value of Le Corbusier, because if nothing, he brings in a new set of metaphors in architecture, which are very important for the country at that time. Like just last week we had this session where one is doing a critique of the new design of the Bombay High Court in Bombay, which is entirely made out of neoclassical architecture. And that is supposed to be built in 2025. Okay, and I mean, all the architects in Bombay came out with pretty much one voice that one shouldn't have such buildings. And I spoke as well. And one of the points which I did make was to look at the High Court that Le Corbusier designs in Chandigarh and how different that is from, say, a design like this, which is just looking back at the past without any context. Where you have, the people can come in large numbers. They enter those vast piers. There is this huge ramp which takes you to the top. There is the metaphor of the parasol. There is this huge roof in the shadow of which justice can be given. So it makes justice much more compassionate compared to, say, this design which we are seeing in Bombay, which makes justice like, justice as fear, justice as awe. So, these two things uh, are completely different. And I think uh, in his secretarial buildings and in the assembly and the high court and the other buildings, especially including that very vast plaza, which gets a lot of criticism, I think he brought in very clear ideas of citizenship and participation and so on. So one need not dismiss Le Corbusier entirely, because he brought new ways by which we could look at how a new nation state should look upon its own citizens. But what definitely Korea does is that from the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya and his later projects, which soon now start to veer towards housing and mass housing.
Peru.
Yeah. They then start to create a greater sense of, who the user is, what the scale is of the person who is using it, what they can and cannot do given their means. And all these modernist ideas are then filtered through the ideas of necessity, the ideas of what a person can handle, and then they emerge into some very interesting designs as well.
Coming to the citizen Charles part of it, I mean, we were just discussing with Deepika just now that the architecture and planning have kind of looked at as two different kind of professions, practice. Unfortunate, because there's so many things that where they come together and shoot. Um, Charles Correa always had this. I mean, he was this idea of the citizen, an idea of making an impact. These two things were not separate for him. He was not an architect who was trying to do something else, or he was not. So in 1954, his thesis was about urban revitalization in Boston, that film that he made. So it was already there. It's not like something he discovered later. He's talking about climate in the 70s. And 70s is the oil shock and all that stuff is going on around that time. So Charles Correa, the urbanist, is not different from Charles Correa, the architect, on the one hand, but also the Charles Correa, the urbanist, could have stood on his own, even if he had no architecture. The urbanist himself had earned a place in history, so to speak, with his various initiatives in the greater common good. Do you want to talk about some of that, and also how a lot of that remained unfulfilled in some ways or the other, and also how things come together? For example, little snippets like when he and his wife were house hunting in Bombay, they discovered that the north-south demand supply issue, that Bombay just couldn't, they didn't have enough land, didn't have enough housing. Or things like they discovered at that time a very young assistant editor of Times of India named George Verghese, who later became the George Verghese. So things, or Mulkraj Anand's role, for example, in Navi Mumbai. So I think there's also a time in Mumbai itself, or in the country itself, where something like a marked piece makes a difference. So quick kind of snapshot on Charles Correa, the urbanist, and also the context within which all this is happening, and how they are using these little slivers of opportunity here and there, which are also very personal experiences. While today, when we look at them later, as Charles Correa Commission reports, they look very arcane and very technical, but actually they're felt experiences, so to speak.
I think in one sense, I would tend to differ a little bit. And this is because if I look back at, say, the kind of pedagogy which we had studying architecture, uh, one of the things that we were told right from the beginning is that an architect is extremely broad in their possibility of making an impact. Uh, I tell my students and that architects are generalists. Okay, there's no such thing as a specialist architect because an architect has to be able to tackle you know projects at different scales, different typologies, different geographical locations. In one sense, you have to have a working knowledge of everything, and you cannot just say that no, I only do this. And Korea in his life is the living example of that. So a true architect is a person who does everything. He's a filmmaker, he draws beautifully, he writes exquisitely, he is an academic, he lectures, he's also an activist when the need be. He's an architect who does amazing buildings, but he also then has a presence in the city in terms of interventions as a citizen more than as a top-down thing. His especially his interactions with the city he lives in, Bombay, are all about his presence as a citizen. One of the reasons I've called this book Citizen Charles is exactly that. And of course the larger idea of planning and urbanism. So he's an architect who's a planner, not a planner per se. So that difference is very important. And in that architect as planner, it's no different than an architect as filmmaker or an architect as an author or so on. It's the same person is, like Whitman says, that I contain multitudes. That is the kind of way I look at Charles Correa. So that is the impact a person with that kind of breadth can have on a country. Uh, it is true that many of his projects, which he tried to do, especially in Bombay, never happened. And they were interventions for improving the public spaces in the city, whether it was on the waterfront or whether it was the mill lands and so on. But the one project that did succeed
Navi
is the
Mumbai.
project of Navi Mumbai or New Bombay. And that, of course, comes out of a whole series of very interesting uh, anecdotal kind of ways. As you said, that when he is looking for a place for, after he is married, and he and Monica are looking out for finding a place, and they go all over Bombay and they don't find anything that they like. And it is in this process he realizes that, the way Bombay is developing is very monolithic in that sense. At the same time, this is 1964, the first development plan of Bombay is brought out. And typically in that development plan, the future of Bombay, the extensions of Bombay are all northwards. Okay. And he instinctively feels that there is life on the other side of the harbor. Bombay is very interestingly shaped. You have this large peninsula in the sea. On the eastern side, you have the docklands, and that creates a large space, a large water body of relatively calm water where the ships can dock. And then you have the mainland on the other side, and that mainland has been forgotten since forever. And life goes on over there. There are other towns and so on. What Korea starts to look at is that why not have an extension of the city on the on the eastern side rather than keep going north. And that's very obvious because, one of the great problems of Bombay is commuting. And that is because of the shape of the city. You just have to go up or down. There is very little east-west connectivity. And according to him, settling an extension of the city on the other side of the water body would probably be a great way of, dealing with this whole idea of commuting and create a greater city built around a water edge. Uh, he then meets two collaborators, Shirish Patel, the structural engineer, and Pravina Mehta, another architect and planner. And together, then they start to figure out things. And they take their ideas to various people in government, and nobody is listening. It's still that same development plan of moving north as far as you can go. So I think in a bit of peak, I think they decide that we shall publish this in the newspapers, and they get hold of this. I think a sub editor, assistant editor, Verghese, in the Times of India, and they present this idea to them. Verghese gets taken up, and on one Sunday in '64, gives them large part of a, in those days, of course, you had big newspapers. So large part of that, and it's called a City on the Sea, and that is where we first see Navi Mumbai presented to the world. What is very, very interesting about that, especially with 60 years down the line, is the fact that there is one diagram which is made by Charles of the peninsular city, and then the large water body, and then the extension on the other side. But what is really important is a large number of dotted lines that go across the water. Okay. And this is really the point. It was intended to be a city that could be accessed through the water. Okay. And that would have made a completely different kind of city, which is something that sadly never happened, still hasn't happened. And so, stupidly, you now still have to kind of do that kind of access. And now you have built these huge trans harbor bridges across, to do what could have easily been done by, ferries. Uh, so that, and he calls that a city on the sea, and that would have been the real case. What has happened is I stay in New Bombay. Unfortunately, New Bombay has no waterfront to talk about, okay, which could have been there on its western edge, and connected the docklands on the east. Never happened. Instead, all the attention was given to highways for motorable roads or a railway. Uh, an opportunity was clearly missed over there.
The other missed opportunity is the Midlands, where his formula
Yeah,
was would have changed the way Bombay looked.
yeah, yeah. But I think in the case of Milllands, it was very, very clear that the stakeholders who came in the way just did not want to lose the opportunity to monetize the land in their hands. And in one sense, the mill land is the harbinger of what is happening even today. Bombay today is open ground completely for any kind of redevelopment you can imagine, irrespective of necessity, of existing situations, of what is there or what is needed, and so on. If you can convert land to you know real estate, you can do that. And that is where I think the mill lands were the first manifestation of that. Converting good land, which could have been really brought into the public realm and been made available to people at large, and nevertheless, doing what was needed to be done, public housing, or even more of real estate for, the kind of corporate kind of real estate, all of which was possible but was never allowed to be executed.
I think the 60s of Mumbai, and the 90s of Mumbai, so to speak, there is a difference.
There is a difference.
Things have changed. Politics has changed. It's not
Politics
no
has
longer
changed,
easy for
and liberalization has come. And in one sense, it is all laissez-faire. After the 90s.
post planning.
Yeah. No, post planning is even after that. Post planning is today. Yeah.
Just to round it up, uh, there's also this, while all this concrete Charles is going on, there's also this metaphysical Charles, and you talk about it.
Yes.
And Charles doesn't shy away from it. So, unmanifest spaces, the Vistara exhibition with Popul Jayakar,
That's
um, bringing back ornament while being an early modernist, almost asking himself questions as he moves. The hotel in Goa,
Yeah.
the Portuguese that Brain Research Center, bringing back color in a way that is it's no longer shorn of adornment. And there is a side to Charles Correa which is deeply, in some ways, mystical. And I wouldn't go as far as Doshi, but there is something going on. It was always in his oeuvre, but it does manifest itself in the manner in as he kind of in at least the later years of his life. In fact, including in his architecture practice, you don't just want to kind of round it up there, saying what was going on there.
So I think it does tie up in a sense to what he was doing earlier. Okay, I look at it as an extension of that, not some sort of vision that suddenly manifests itself.
Mhm.
Somewhere he has written that architecture is a three-legged stool. Okay, and it's a stool with three legs. One is technology, one is climate, and one is culture.
Mhm.
So culture, in that sense, is an important thing. But in the early buildings, it can be you tend to subsume that with the ideas of climate, which are very predominant. So climate and the context in which you are building determines what the building should look like, or how the building should be shaped, and so on. Not so much, the cultural aspects of it. But I mean, I contradict myself here. When we take the Gandhi Smarak Sangrahalaya,
Back to Whitman.
it is very much a cultural place.
Mhm.
Okay, so in that he recognizes the value of the people who are visiting that center and the metaphorical notion of Gandhi and how a building to Gandhi should be. But later, as it happens, and I think this is just he's a voracious reader. He's very intellectual. He has amazing capacity to seek confluences in a variety of subjects. He starts to look at ideas that are very Indian in definition. Okay, not in a mystical sense, as far as I'm concerned, but mainly things that are there. Again, kit of parts. That there are repetitive ideas that one sees even in the culture in India, which we tend to bring out from time to time. Like, say, for example, the idea of the ritualistic pathway is a very common thing, but we may call it a very Indian thing as well. Okay, the idea of the empty center. Okay, and from that he also seeks certain amount of imagery that overlaps, and that is where you start to see the Vastu Purusha Mandala. Okay, because that is a clear 9 square uh, diagram with an empty center.
Kabbalah, most Kabbalistic. No?
Not so much so, but in this case, it is more the Vastu Purush, because the empty center is the Brahmastan, the place of Brahma, and that is where it is uh, it is empty, and that ties up very clearly with the idea that he has in most of his buildings of creating courtyards. Whether it's the housing he does or whether more public buildings he does, and but he then overtly brings out those images. Like, say, for example, when he does the Jawahar Kala Kendra in Jaipur, the plan of the building is a mandala, okay, with an empty center in the middle. But the plan of the building is also the plan of Jaipur, which was a mandala, okay, and including one square which is kind of twisted outside because of, I think, the contours in Jaipur that required that one square to be. So he does the same thing in the Jawahar Kala Kendra, and that is where you have the entrance into the thing. And then he brings in the ideas in that building, which I think is the most. Uh, in this building, you have a lot of quotations for various Indian uh, metaphors, like the different planets. So each square is for a different planet, and so on. But I do not see, at the same time, you would find that in the later days, there is the rise of what we now popularly call Vastu, right? Which is, you have a bunch of experts who will tell you how your house should be arranged based on the principles, as they say into quotation marks, as per Vastu. I don't think Charles Correa is doing any of that. Okay, but Charles Correa brings in a set of images that we can take from the past, whether they come from say miniature paintings, that are done in history, or whether they are from vernacular kind of diagrams, or whether they are from other kind of sources. I don't see the mysticism in it. It's more a reflection of what he himself calls deep structures, which are there in the psyche of Indians who are who grow up in a particular culture, that he then brings out. So, like, say, for example, in some buildings, like say the British Council Library, he will even put the char bagh, which is like a Mughal garden, because that is also part of a deep structure, okay, of the understanding of a building in a paradise garden, something like that. So I wouldn't look at it as a mystical thing. It's more, how do we express ourselves?
In that sense, different from Doshi.
Yeah. Now, in that, you bring in color. In that, you bring in different types of textures and shapes and all that. So if you look at the Vidhan Bhavan in Bhopal, there too you have a certain amount of mandala with an empty square, and so on. But if you look at, say, the Siddhartha Goa, which he does in Goa, there he brings in a lot of color that he associates with Fontainhas or the Portuguese, and so on. So he's eclectic in that sense.
How are we doing on time? Yeah, we should now turn tables.
Shall we?
You want to go this side? Or we should, or I'm fine this way.
We're fine.
Well, it's not like the mastermind
No.
or the interrogation chamber. So how do you want to? You want to just
So yeah, no. I would. Firstly, I enjoyed talking with you about Korea, and I think one has to return the compliment by talking to you about your book, which is quite a substantial book to begin with. I mean,
By the way, Mustansir is also a very well-regarded poet. So in poetry circles, he's one of the more respected names around.
well, I have books of poetry, but none of them have this thickness.
There's museum fatigue and poetry fatigue.
Yeah. No, but see, so in order to overcome museum fatigue, this book divides itself into some beautiful sections, and so you can look at them even from that way. That this is a very well structured book in terms of how you have organized your poems, and the substantial number of them, using ideas which come from rasa.
Mm.
So you have sections called wonder, sorrow, courage, fear, anger, laughter, and so on. And they are wonderful. They really help you to navigate through this. And as happens with books of poetry, you don't read it from the beginning to the end. It is something that you can keep on entering from anywhere, and still find meaning and still find delight, which one does tend to find in this. The other important thing about this book is that it's not restricted to any one thematic limitation. This is a broad book, in the sense, like we are talking about Korea as a person who does so many things. In the same manner, you have an amazing diversity of subjects that have been the muse to write the poems, whether it is history, whether it is location, geography, some personal uh, poems as well, uh, whether
Architecture. Architecture.
there is architecture, very much so. There is even Parveen Babi, but there is also the idea of a sense of history, a sense of there are a lot of literary allusions to several of the poems. So, in one sense, everything this contains the world, so to speak, and it is a lovely title. Then, most appropriate to call this a different story. So I could perhaps just begin by asking you that, what did you, how did you go about putting this together? Because I assume you must have written these poems, I mean, not in sequence surely, but over a longish period of time.
Yeah, this is my third book. So usually the first book, as Seamus Henny says, you must get it out of the way because it's usually about childhood and all your kind of that kind of thing. You have to get it out. So River Wedding was one of those, very dense but short, and it did very well. Surprising, went to the Sahitya Academy shortlist and so on. Very pleasantly surprised. Um, Vital Signs was written during COVID, so it has a lot of medical, health, etc., in it. Um, Perhaps encouraged by the relative kind of success of the first two, I felt that I had the courage to kind of spread my arms a little, or wings, as you may say. And one part of it was that I was increasingly getting. I didn't like the way poetry was or is being written, especially in the West, and where Indian English poetry stands today. Uh, so, for example, the narrative is almost, it's like your architecture and planning. The idea that poetry could tell tales, tall ones at that, has disappeared. So it's becomes kind of some kind of an abstraction which people can't relate to. One of the things which I was so happy to know just after the Mumbai Lit Fest, with a packed house and some experience of a lifetime, was people came to me and said that we can relate to your poetry. So I wanted to write stuff which people could understand and relate to very clearly. I also wanted to bring the story and the poem together through the form of poetry, as it may. So the narrative and the lyric are not two different worlds, but what I'm calling lyric narrative, which is that I could have thick description inside it and do that. Um,
But
if
this is as opposed to what that gets your grouse, that you don't like.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that. Uh, yeah, the other thing is also you get the confidence to do more and more of your stuff when uh, you don't really care about its reception in the West. I mean, I'll be very frank here. So poetry is increasingly becoming theoretical there, and the feeling is missing, affect is missing, and the tale is missing. So poetry is what right now, because of the printing press and Gutenberg and all that, we have all this. But poetry is initially the bard, the minstrel,
The oral.
the oral. Homer, all that was the epic is actually a in verse. So it's so that element has gone out of poetry, and therefore it's gotten very relegated to very solitary corners where the poet is conceived as this romantic figure who's wandering in the clouds, and so on and so forth. So one is that. The other is also I inhabit, like you, many worlds, and so those worlds also give me material to engage with. So therefore, I think that is a blessing. While that there is dissonance, I think the dissonance is required. If everything was smooth, there'd be no poetry. But on this rasa thing, yes, it's an organizing principle for the book because I needed to kind of museum fatigue, as you say. So there had to be some way to organize it. But the other thing I also was trying to hit at is, see, if I organize a book of poetry along otherwise mundane containers like grief, sorrow, laughter, it's almost perceived as juvenile. No, I mean this is like some juvenilia, or some first timer is trying out this stuff. So I also want to turn it on its head by doing stuff which is not fashionable currently along contemporary literary trends, especially in contemporary poetry, uh, which is that nobody would risk doing a book which says, okay, I'm going to write about hope, because it's perceived as though this is going to be some very trite stuff and unreadable. But to me, these are very elemental human things. Anger, all of this, courage, all of this is part of who we are. And I mean, if you read the Greeks, you read, it's also a way of reclaiming that space. Shall we put it that way? So, what would the West look at? They would consider this very sentimental. So, they dismiss it as sentimental because they are not comfortable with dealing with emotions. And that, I think, is a problem of modernism itself in literary in the literary world. So, when an increase, and especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, where English writing in poetry is, maybe it's Eliot or whoever, is abstracted. And I wanted to get out of that abstraction and deal with the real world. And in that real world, how do you kind of navigate that and play around with that and write intimate poetry, as it were? Is something that,
One of the things that
yeah,
I like is that there's really no need to be defensive about anything.
yeah,
You write your poems,
yeah.
whatever moves you to write the poems, and they would be, as you said, you inhabit so many different worlds, and some of them are independent, and some of them are, conflating into each other, each of which is creating something of interest, and so on.
There's
It's
one more thing. Also, I mean, the rasas just to kind of, the rasas I discovered, I mean, the kind of aesthetic uh, criticism, the kind of literary criticism going around in India around the 10th century and earlier on the rasas is unbelievable.
mm,
I mean, but it's ironical that it took Sheldon Pollock to
yeah,
show it to us,
bring it back. Yeah.
bring it back. And his translations of Dante in 6th century, writing about the looking glass of poetry, learning that that treatise actually influenced late Tang dynastic poetry in China, influenced South Asia poetry, etc., and writing criticism. So there's so much of stuff going on at that time, which I unfortunately has become orientalized because of the containers in which we live. So, but the other thing, Mustansir, is that I think this is also some kind of a reclamation of the provincial, and I think that's also done
Intent.
with intent.
Mm.
So this is not the cosmopolitan writing for a global audience with cleverly translated, writing which is meant for an international thing, but just doing one's thing. And I think the reclamation of the provincial also coincides with some stuff that has happened in my personal life, which is, my mom was not doing well for a long, long time, and I reconnected with uh, community in that sense, with people I hadn't known or met who last met me 30 years ago, and was pleasantly surprised to find community still existing in Guwahati, and 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 people who I had known in childhood who are now kind of getting on, um, welcomed me with open arms. So the prodigal son, so to speak, returned,
Mm.
and I think, hello. So so it is an unapologetic uh, writing from the provinces, not as margins, but as worlds in themselves, and proudly so. So the post-colonial project does not necessarily have to go through Delhi or Mumbai or Lucknow, so to speak, and could well exist on its own terms, from whichever locations I was writing from. So it's in that sense, this book is also uh, perhaps a book in and of Assam, but different from the childhood nostalgic trips that characterized perhaps my first book, Little Lyric Effect. But here, the game is a little different.
I didn't necessarily see it rooted in a place.
Yeah, it's not.
It's not. And in fact, I do still see it as cosmopolitan, but not in a global sense.
Yeah.
In say our sense.
Yeah.
It is, we are cosmopolitan beings in say a city like Bangalore. And that is the kind of cosmopolitan affect that one
So
gets.
I'd love to take this book to Guwahati, where and read in front of, uh, say, Cotton University, where my dad taught, and see what it does.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
stuff like that. So,
But
yeah,
I'm sure it's very much part of that, just as it's part of this. Or if you read these poems in Bombay, they would fit in perfectly.
some of them.
Yeah, some, not exactly some of them. I would say all of them, because then in that sense, that is the challenge of the listener, who has to, who a person who is hearing the poems also has to take the effort to kind of make sense out of it, or to get from a poem what they can get, each individual, each
So I'll read up.
person.
Read
I
a
think
few.
what you, yeah, definitely. Let's, why don't you read a
Yeah.
few?
This one's a personal poem. Um, it's called My Father's Birthday. My dad teaches English, so he taught English literature all his life. Um, an ancient date breathes peacefully in the dark. November 9th, or is it 25th? Ma doesn't know. Father, fifth born of nine, in a village now modern with smartphones, is happy without birthdays. I let the secret rest. It doesn't want to be ruffled by glitter and confetti. November comes and goes without incident. It is the way it is. Each day, a possible birthday. In that tumultuous year, 1947, a turning point in the pages of a family history. Or so we think. Till one day we celebrate his 77th birthday on 1st October, a day before Bapu's. The day he was born, he says. And we believe him and bring a cake to light the occasion. We sing happy birthday to you. We have mutton pulao for dinner. His granddaughter takes out a pack of missing cards for Rummy. We think of all those years without a birthday. You mentioned Parveen Babi. Uh, let's go for it. Who doesn't like Parveen Babi? This one's called A Speck of Ash recounts listening to Parveen Babi and Danny. Danny is Danny Dengzongpa. For old timers, there was a scene. So this is a speck of ash recounting, your witness to the occasion. Once flicked by those dry, delicate fingers, I settled slowly into the bottom of the glass she held with her other hand, a gin and tonic, half drunk. She was wandering, wordless, back of her mind while she was talking to him about that day in the film sets. When the director asked her if she preferred cherries to tomatoes, she replied with her red lipstick smile that her tastes were erudite. She remembered her literature class and asked the director if he knew Spencer, not Tracy, but Edmund, the fairy queen. The director looked at her puzzled and signaled to others, who too laughed, that she was a little strange and whispered in her ear that he would check the word up in a dictionary. She was telling him all that while half wondering if she could drink it up, or at one go, or take it slowly with languor, take her time, with the strange man who insisted on calling himself Shering. She told him Danny suited him better. He was talking about how he made it to med school when her lips half parted and she reached for the glass. And she flicked her cigarette one more time. I was still going down then, eager to listen to what happened next and not get swallowed whole in a flood of emotion, a swell of gin laced turquoise dream of the 70s. She paused. Just when the glass came to her mouth, she sipped gently, and as I was listening, put it down again so that I could hear the rest of the story. Thank you. The credo of the book is actually in the first poem, and that's I'm slightly unabashed about it. It's called Turning Points. I like the kind of history that clutches banana flowers at the doorstep and brings them to the kitchen for a good meal. The kind of history where father says this has not been done before, where women sing together in empty lots, a clapping club, but there are voices and they are happy. History that passes mouth to mouth like a long curved line zigzagging across the years, a river that grows with every mile. Spare me the battles, the encampments, the throne, who ruled when and how. They all turn into grass. In my world, there are three ways to make it count. First, if the way you came back is different from the way you left. Second, if no one remembers you anymore, even those you once knew. Third, during oral renderings of life stories, popularly called mythologies, if you moved someone from stone. This one's called The Guwahati I Knew. The Guwahati I knew was kind to strangers and stopped by for tea. She invited people with betel nut and pan, made room for an extra guest. That Guwahati made me feel haunted, for there was no news of tomorrow. She lived in the past. The present was forbidding. The city slaked her thirst by the river, where villagers came early morning, carrying their defiant dreams in wicker baskets of fish and green. That Guwahati had few cars and even fewer dreams. Gun-toting policemen marched gravel roads, breaking the silence of evening with windowpane clatter, a scream too muffled to hear. That Guwahati had fun and games, artists who ran cafes, held up on bamboo stilts, near the ancient museum no one visited anymore, where fathers waited outside the stadium to discuss a theorem of physics, a translation of poems in the little magazine. Kids willingly crossed merry streets like a breeze, empty of traffic, filled with laughter. But evening wailed long sirens home, news of blood splutter in the morning. But on dusty afternoons, the games went on as before. Twilight flickered in the corner, making room for a woman coughing, a mother brewing noodles for neighborhood kids on her son's birthday, with extra helpings at home, while an uncle looked for cigarette butts near the common drain. A cricket bat, mud splashed, stood slanted on the wall. The wall burst with posters about blood and guts by morning. And one day we decided to all leave one by one, leaving ourselves behind in that strange city now overgrown with shops and malls, money growing on trees, choking the roads. Giant as ambition, a tall ad hoarding the sky, well lit now and without a bookshop to wander into. That Guwahati now lives only in my poems and perhaps in the hearts of people who know what it is to feel fear and hope glowing together, what it is to walk in the evenings and sit by the vast river in the lonely dark. What it was to buy candles and pens from the candy shop when the lights went out and there was nothing to do. What it meant to dream of going away and not listen to the wise ones who said, stay. What it means now to read these lines trembling in the dark, the ones that go places without moving. Thank you. And then again, back to tradition. This poem is called I Entered a Vinod Kumar Shukla poem. So Vinod Kumar Shukla is the rage these days. He's won the Gyanpit last year, lives in Raipur, never travels. When you asked about his influences in comparative literature, he says, what is that? Um, and has been translated very well. Uh, my influences in poetry are also predominantly poems I've read in translation. So I feel that my English is actually world literature. And world literature is not like a afterthought like world music, or after the Rolling Stones and everything's done, you discover Ali Farkatur and say, now, where do we put this person? And you say it's world literature. So, but world poetry, as you know, this project of world poetry is also synonymous with modernism. So, all these people who are actually writing world poetry, and many English poets are also doing so. People like us are doing that. I entered a Vinod Kumar Shukla poem through the open window and found a world inside. Looking for a cricket ball from childhood, the one that smashed a window pane, living smithereens, and bringing everyone out from their homes to watch kids scurrying away. Inside, a cold, dark table, no one there. I felt my way along the walls, an old clock chiming. The kid now works in America and is looking for a green card, the one that will keep him there forever. The father is walking into sunset. But there is still some journey left to watch a cricket match somewhere along the well-worn road, on a dusty streets, on a dusty street, where windows crackle when old. That cricket ball must be somewhere in the corner. It must have sneaked under the bed. I look for the bed, now no longer there. The ball must have rolled into the kitchen, filled with yesterday's utensils, pots and pans, raising a racket, tinkling old laughter. It must have come out through the open door, settling by the drain somewhere, where tufts of wild grass grow, tall as reawakening. I sneak out of the house on tiptoe, careful not to wake those sleeping. Through a gap between the stanzas, I jump, finding myself somewhat strange to be out again inside the world, holding a comma, the question mark still eluding me. Instead of a cricket ball, only the pages turned as one round year became another. Thanks. Short poem, short poem. I just usually I do this. Sometimes I just flip and whatever comes. This was called Nansuk. So how many people know about Nansuk? So of course. So Nansuk is so if you've read B.N. Goswami, Goswami with a Y, um, who died a couple of years ago, and did the most remarkable work on medieval Indian art and especially miniatures um, of the kind that was never seen before. And if I go into the academic mode, his genealogies of artists actually came from reading land grant records of Benares, because the land grants were what the patrons gave the artists. So he traces a particular family, so to speak, which was Nansuk and Manaku, his brother. And as you know, Western art, it's very individual. So you know Da Vinci, you know Raphael, you know all of that, right? It's a very different. Indian art, more craft. It's more like artisans. It's more art. So the artist is an individualized person. But B.N. Goswami is a fantastic work, and Marg being another place where he used to write, and he'd been doing this since the 60s, and only late in his life, as he was kind of much later in his life, did B.N. Goswami become so famous, like he became a phenomenon. Um, I discovered Nansuk through B.N. Goswami and also through, I think, Amit Datta's fantastic documentary. Um, and see it if you can get it. Anyway, long story for a short poem. Nansuk was in your living room dark, the blinds drawn, morning not trickling in yet. He looked at the wall, sunlight streaming into a pool, its lush yellow swirling with feeling. Then he stepped out on tiptoe, not waiting for the tea you call him for. Once out, he was at the country fair with me all day, with merry-go-rounds, turnstiles, and rock songs. Wearing shorts, surprised to see his knees so bare. I asked if he would like to paint this, but he didn't answer. He kept looking at the merry-go-round as if it held a clue to his life. Then he skirted the edge of field as dusk began to fall and disappeared into the book of miniatures where I remembered this scene like a painting. हो गया? Yeah, one more. ये तो कितना सारा है. Um, want some city poem, no? कुछ मजा तभी आएगा. One second. There's a poem called Graduation Day, which is graduation ceremony. Maybe there's some city poem which can come in. Okay, fragility, temporary, transience. There's not graduation day, but this is something else. This is called the last potter of Mohenjo-daro. So, we are all temporary inhabitants. But our time here is precious and therefore we need to enjoy it. The last potter of Mohenjo-daro. Little is known of the last potter of Mohenjo-daro. What he had for breakfast, if rain lashed his shadow. Did he know of the storm coming? Climate change. Was it wheat or barley he loved? Who loved him more, his wife or his child? Did he like to talk before or after work? Did he start his day at dawn or dusk? Did he toil all day? Were there dancing girls in his dreams? Perhaps summer storms? Did he earn an extra buck for that pipe under that rich man's house? Who did he bake his kiln with? When he fired it, was he alone? Was he silent most days, or did it depend on the weather? Did he like a drink or two? Did he play the fool, or was he taciturn? There's something else unanswered. Why did he take this up? What inner urge? What outer fire? Forged with bare hands, this wheel of time, this cup for water, glazed sunshine pouring into his life like a mixed blessing. This red, dark earth baked with the dry clay of ambition? Or was it just vigor, desire to make new? Modernism. That's Ezra Pound, by the way. Make it new. Did he know what he was about to do? Was work and play ever one? What did he munch for lunch? And who did he call out to that day after the meal, knowing he would return for one more summer? Thank you. This one's called Graduation Ceremony. Tiny grandmother nibbles little morsels alone at the table. Little bird, we call her. Her granddaughter graduated today. We heard her speak on stage. So fluent in English, flying on a cloud like a poem by Wordsworth. More dal, please. No one asked her what she wanted those days. Now she's eating as if doing croquet embroidery. Dedicated, painstaking, attending to every detail, yet easy on the eye. Those who can still see. patterns on her plate, a nest of rubies, or maybe cauliflowers. Someone points to her, a teacher, they say, bringing warmth from a setting sun back to the heart. Grandmother continues to find meaning in little nuggets. Her granddaughter wants to change the world. Thank you. Oh, nice. And both Mustansir and my book, very proud to say, doing very well, getting very nice press, excellent reviews, like so happy. You know, very good people have picked it up and it's doing very well. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. You can take a photo of us holding this. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thank you.
Open to questions. Now we know what Hamlan does during graduations. Secret is out. But anyone?
And we feel free to ask whatever. It's like, yeah, it's open house. It's a quiet audience, intimate audience. This is the best audience, actually. It's like, yeah.
Since we have a poet and an architect in the room, I wanted to ask, is there poetry in architecture? And
Two poets.
two poets and an architect. But I wanted to ask if there's like, do you know of architects, or what is your impression of poetry in architecture? Because you gave us some examples of the court and justice being served when the speaker went off. But and to you, Amlan, is there architecture in poetry? In the way you think of framing it, structure,
some of that stuff,
rhythm, and all of that.
Yeah, sure.
Well, yes, of course, there is poetry in architecture. I have looked at poetry in architecture, especially at the level of a city. It's not so much one building being poetry, although there are such, but the rhythms of a city in terms of the way buildings are arrayed on it. I find definitely certain poetic devices that I can use to explain them. There are, in very good parts of the city, there are these amazing harmonies that are created by sets of buildings, even though each building may be completely different. And wherever that occurs, you will know for yourself, even at a very subconscious level, that you're walking through a nice street, or that you are in a nice, plaza, or something like that. So yes, of course, there is poetry.
Yeah. Yeah. So the architecture, the poetry, you said poetry in architecture. So the architecture of poetry. Yeah. So there's some very good stuff going on right now where installation artists who are also kind of poets are creating concrete poetry. So which is uh, infinite. It's almost like the Charles Correa kind of that Hornby train set, where you're using words, you're creating paper, you're creating tangible. It's not letters on a page, but you're actually creating tangible works, which are installations, but not just poetic effect, but you're actually doing a poem, and it's fascinating stuff. I know a couple of people who've tried that out, and yeah, there's that. But also even the way you, I've always played around with that with spaces. Space between words, between stanzas, between I have never been very rigid about. My gaps in space in between words are intentional. They might look like printers devils, but actually they're not. So the gap is intended at uh, conveying something which, and I think I've learned those tricks from various. But Arun Kolatkar is certainly one example. If you've come across Jejuri in its original Pras Publications book, where Kolatkar, who was a designer himself, it's a squarish kind of thing, and there are lots of blank pages before he gets to a poem, and a lot of those poems. So then, for example, the way you So there's a poem, for example, page 228. I don't want to read it, but it's called "In Praise of Slowness." So in that poem, "In Praise of Slowness," and I heard some very nice things from Malashri Lal. She figured this one and said, "Hang on, you're doing some interesting things here." So what I do is the stuff I write, the stuff about haste is written like tuck, 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 tuck. And then I somewhere in the middle I say I now love slowness, and then the gaps increase, and the gaps between words inside that line increase, and then I'm kind of delaying the thing, almost like a musical thing, and I don't let the penny drop till I do that. So and then I talk about a slow cycle race in school, and all of that. So there is all that, and one of somebody who encouraged me at least in the early years and who still has a nice word or two whenever we still exchange mails is a very renowned poet named Philip Gross. And Philip Gross, teacher, librarian, and all that. So he would tell me that poems need to be good neighbors. Back to your point about how do you a book as massive as 250 pages without going through poetry fatigue, even for the poet. How do you do that? So one thing is the poems need to talk to each other. So either as Jugalbandi or as neighbors, whether they're envious or proud of each other. So there is that. And then there is also the way you align not just the gaps, but also how you align and thankfully you're justified. How do you kind of center align stuff? Your center stuff. So I have a poem called "The Heart of Silence," and it echoes a little bit with what your empty silence thing, which itself is a kind of a Zen Buddhism idea, uh, where I center align the entire thing and leave gaps there. So the letters are not just in terms of um, what the words are and what the meaning it conveys. And this also I've learned from rasa theory. So where is rasa? Rasa, one way to look at rasa is there's laughter, humor, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I invented one, by the way, here, but I won't tell you which one. I dropped one rasa and I put one of my own. And I'm not the first one to do that. But as I later discovered, there used to be 33 rasas and 100 rasas. And there's a lot of theory on that. But I did something sneaky here. So the 9 rasas here are actually not the 9 rasas of Abhinavagupta or, so I did some funny things there. So the rasa stuff is interesting because it's not just about these emotions on which you write stuff, but there's also this thing of where is rasa? Is it in the text? Is it in the poet or the writer? Because if you don't have rasa, is it that X factor inside, which is that you might have everything, but without that X factor, it just doesn't work, like a building. You enter a building and then you feel like, ye kya hai? And we were discussing a couple of those just before our session. No names. Anyway, we put no names also. But there's that. And then there is the X factor building, which is like something is working here. I feel like hanging around. I feel like hanging out here. I feel nice here. It gives me something to do, and it's nice. I feel it, and you can't pin it down. So there is this thing of the X factor in the text, and that's where the ras is, the flavor, the juice. Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan talks about it. Abida Parveen has juice. You listen to her, there's something going on there in a way that others don't. There's that, but there's also this thing of is the rasa in the writer? But there's this very interesting move in rasa theory itself, which happens around the 10th century, where they start saying, no, damn it, it's not in the text, it's not in rasa is this. It's the mood, it's the atmosphere you're creating. And that is rasa, which you get in a classical music concert somewhere around the 30, and as you're kind of deep inside in, and suddenly you are in a different space and you're like, oh. So therefore this somewhat interesting, question on architecture of poetry leads you to very interesting places, and which is where I keep saying that if one is not too bothered about popularity, name, fame, being in literary festivals, the like, success, I think the world is very varied and very rich for us to keep experimenting in it. And I think the experiments is what makes play happen. I think we write stuff because we feel good writing it, and we get kicks out of it at the end of the day. And those kicks, if we get kicks out of it, it's possible that somebody around also gets kicks out of it. And that makes life happen. I think that's Russ. That's what Russ is. Mhm.
So, if an observer or a reader or a listener, uh, whether it's a building or a poem,
If you're a Russic.
yeah, they may have a completely, different take on certain aspects, which may not, which may be, be different from the ones who created it. And so, have you, actually had experience where somebody, an observer, has actually seen a new dimension or felt a new dimension that perhaps the architect or the poet may not have actually imagined to that level? Is that if you've come across somebody who came up and expressed that?
I'll take it after you.
And you were pleasantly surprised to find something new in your own work.
I mean, I'd like to answer this as a poet, not as an architect. In architecture, I believe the opportunities are, especially in the architecture we build today, the opportunities are relatively less. Things are much more as they are. But when it comes to poetry, uh, as a poet, it is a source of infinite delight to me when people see things differently. I wrote because of certain reasons, but once that poem is out in the world, in one sense, it's no longer the poet's poem. It is the reader's poem and should always continue to be the reader's poem. And the manner in which the reader reads it, enjoys it, appreciates it, doesn't like it, all these are completely relevant to me as the person who wrote the poem in the first place. So yes, you're absolutely right that many times, people see your poem in a different way that you had not thought about. But then what I thought about is just one amongst 1,000 different ways in which one can look at a poem.
I think one reason I write poetry is because it makes me feel strange, and this is like it makes me feel uncanny. And what is uncanny? Sometimes when I read my own work, I wonder if I wrote it. Is that me? Was that me? And I think there is something in the text itself which is different from the person writing the text. And so, depending on that context, it happens to not just a reader, but even if I'm the writer who's reading it, uh, like really, and not in a very critiquey sense. I'm not talking about critiquey. I'm just saying it feels uncanny to see those. So that's one part. The other part is, as Mustansir said, is that yes, uh, one may have written with a certain context, as wide as the word context is, in mind, or whatever was going through the poets or the writers. But the reader may, in through the same words, have a totally different depending on the reader's context. So there is no one authentic meaning conveyed by a text. And I'll give you an example. In my previous book, Vital Signs, somebody, I get very heartwarming mails, and that takes care of, all the all the difficult days, frankly. Um, and this person who I'll just call her a reader. She's many other things, but I won't go there. Um, she wrote to me that she started reading Vital Signs, and suddenly her husband had a sudden heart attack and passed away without just happened. It's one of those things. And then the book stayed there, and then all the the death stuff happened, and then she came back to the book once things had settled. And she said that the same poem began to mean different to her, while the person is the same reader. And that, I mean, it's another matter that some of, she thanked me for that, the fact that it gave her some solace, etc. But that's a different part. But the idea that one could find, the reader could find a different set of meanings, and not just meanings, because sometimes things don't have to mean anything. That's the best part about poetry. It doesn't have to logically mean something or be about something. It just needs to be there, and if it has juice, it'll click. In that sense, the more the merrier. Um, um, and of course, bad reviews do that all the time, which is that they find stuff that you have never possibly conceived of, and they say, and I've encountered those ones too. So yeah, and it's out there, no? It's out there. So there is no original meaning in that sense. It's a bunch of meanings, and these things change. Yeah.
There's also the fact that you're talking to living poets. Okay, and poetry will typically outlast the poet. And then how do you read it? So, like, say, how do you read Rumi today? How do you read Kalidasa today? The intention of the poet is no longer there. So, there can be a variety of ways in which that can be read. But I mean, to just to kind of give another little dimension, is that some poems, and many of the poems in this book, are very clearly, obviously about something. And if you know the allusion and you know the context, then in fact the enjoyment of the poem is increased because you know what the poem is about. That is something I'd like to say as well. Sometimes, as in this case also, and I have done it in my books, in the end, you write a series of notes that allow people to, access certain contexts, not explain the poem, just give the context for the poem. And that helps as well.
There's a poem here called When Annapurna Devi Plays the Surbahar. Now, for those who don't know Annapurna Devi, or who don't know what the Surbahar is, or who don't know Annapurna Devi's place in Indian classical music, or the Surbahar's exalted place, which has since kind of, strangely, slowly disappeared. Um, it is difficult, especially for a Western kind of reader to. Um, but uh, this poem is actually about synesthesia. So that is an experience of feeling the fragrance of pink roses when she's playing, and her disciples talk about it. They mention it. They say this. They felt it when she would play in the wee hours of dawn, and they would just be entranced by the experience of listening to Annapurna Devi live. On the past and present front, I I don't make myths stuff of the past. I make myths contemporary. So I bring folklore to life and make it present. And therefore, they are no longer mythologies for me, but they're as mythical as you and me. So that is something that is it's possibly a trick of the trade, but more than that, it's also an experience. So therefore, I render all these. So when I'm writing about characters, there's Fellini or whatever. It's not about Fellini as much as that Fellini has become a character in this book, or whoever you talk about, Annapurna Devi or whoever. This is not about Annapurna Devi, but they are all becoming mythologies around, in the same way, say, a Krishna or a Karna who also feature, and then they bounce off each other and they do stuff around each other and they do interesting things together. So therefore, it becomes alive and contemporary for me, and it has to work, of course. So yeah, but the past has to be made present.
I thought the cricket ball wandering was connecting past and present.
yeah, till it becomes a comma and you go, and the ball becomes round and round like the seasons. So, so there's that. So, which is almost surreal and therefore a tribute, in fact, to Vinod Kumar Shukla, whose Hindi stuff is that, where you suddenly you're walking as if there is just mango trees and guava orchards and it's all very nice and rural Arcadia. And suddenly he delivers a punch on that line, and you're like, you are deep inside a cesspool. But this is where I feel that we have a lot in India, and I think we can really play with what we have. And I think it's a very underestimated and not well done thing. There is a difficult. I mean, there is the danger of being typecast as an Orientalist, but I feel that these labels really don't really matter, because when you're dabbling with very interesting stuff, and it's no different from the architecture project also. I mean, I am not ashamed of ornament anymore. The whole idea that, oh, poetry should be short of ornament, it should just be like very precise. And I want to let the words travel. It's okay. It doesn't, somebody says, oh, this doesn't look like poetry. It's like, oh man, I could have written that. Ah, that's the point. If you could have written that, yeah, why not do it? That's the point. Then it becomes no longer a thing which is practiced by some elevated in the clouds person. So, and then it becomes more alive, so to speak, and it has a life of its own. And thank you. It's 8 on a Wednesday. Some of us have 2 hours to travel. So I guess.
Yes, thank you, everyone. We can close now. Congratulations on the new books, and
Thank you.
lovely, insightful session this was. Thank you very much. Good night.